It's time for another edition of In the News, the popular segment where we look at classic wrestling newspaper stories that will be read by the Bill Butel of the Super Podcast, none other than Mr. Jim Cornette.
I'd prefer to be the John Cameron Swayze, but nevertheless.
Well, nevertheless, our first story, Jim, comes from Chillicothe, Missouri, the Constitution Tribune from August 3rd, 1961.
I was not aware there was another Chillicothe besides Ohio. Wrestlers win match with deer on road. 3 professional wrestlers escaped injury early today when the car in which they were riding struck a deer. Ronald Lewis Etchison, 41, Santa Cruz, California, was the driver of the 1961 Dodge Coach that hit the deer on US 36, 10 miles west of Chillicothe at 1:30 a.m. The animal ran onto the road and Etchison was unable to avoid it. With Etchison were Bobby Graham and Buddy Austin. They had been wrestling in Iowa. The car was towed to St. Joseph. The deer, which was killed by the collision, was disposed of by Koval Gann, conservation agent.
I'm glad he got a plug there at the end. I'm curious. I don't hear too much about wrestlers hitting deers. I know it even happened to me one time years ago on the way back from a show. I was in a minivan. Georgia Macropolis had like a brand new minivan. A deer just destroyed it in 2 seconds in the middle of the night in Pennsylvania. So I've been a part of it, and this story obviously is about it, but are there a lot of stories you know of wrestlers hitting deers?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, it used to be just occupational hazard. One night in Evansville, Christine Jarrett was going crazy because Lawler hadn't got there yet, and she got a phone call that he had hit a deer on the way from Nashville to Evansville, which is almost a 3-hour drive, and tore up his car, and somewhere or another he got a ride or got taken back to Nashville and chartered a plane. This was back when you didn't do that type of thing in territory wrestling, just charter a plane willy-nilly. Yeah. But he got one, and because, I mean, it was a decent house in Evansville that night, which would, have been probably 900,000 people, which would have been probably $6,000-$8,000 at the gate. So they didn't want to give that back. So he chartered the plane and was able to make the main event. I made the big announcement, ladies and gentlemen, Jerry Lawler has struck a deer on the way, and everybody, whoa! I said, but he's chartered a plane and going to be here, and a big pop, right? We got there for a week. Everybody called him the Deer Slayer.
Was there a place where there were more deer than other places? I mean, were there specific roads in Tennessee that you knew there would be deers on?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, do you have deer crossing signs up there?
We have some, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have, but I mean, there's no really way to tell. It's just that every once in a while, especially in the middle of the night and you're out in the country, one of those little darling deers can run out of the woods before you know it, and boom. And if it's a little baby, that's terrible. But if it's a full-grown deer, both of you are going to feel the effects.
Jim, for the stories we read on In the News, we usually focus on some remarkable or some crazy story from the newspapers. For this next one, it's a little unique. We're actually just going to read a straight-up result from a newspaper, but in and of itself, it's pretty remarkable. Let's go to Amarillo, Texas, July 29th, 1965.
Funk Sr. and DiBiase wrestle 3 hours. Wrestling history was recorded Thursday night at the Amarillo Sports Arena. Dory Funk Sr. and Iron Mike DiBiase battled 3 hours and 10 minutes in a Texas death match. It was stopped at 1 a.m. by orders of Kirby Suggs of the Texas Athletic Commission because of curfew and on the advice of a physician. Both Funk and DiBiase were badly cut around the face. According to the National Wrestling Alliance headquarters in St. Louis, it's the longest match in the past 25 years. There wasn't a decision, so Funk retains his North American Championship. In a Texas death match, falls don't count. The men go until one of them can't continue. As a special bonus, each fall was worth $50 to the winner, and each man had 5. Most of the near-capacity crowd was still on hand when the match was stopped. Tim Woods, Ricky Romero, and Jose Lothario came out with a triumph over Killer Carl Cox in the semifinal. Cox stopped Woods with a press after 9:29 in the first fall. Romero used a press to conquer Yankee number 2 in the second at 6:50. Woods finished Cox with a brainbuster in the third at 3:58. The brainbuster is Killer Carl's favorite weapon. He was trying to use it on Woods, but failed and was a victim of it himself. Klondike Bill disposed of Jerry Starr in 6:52 with a squasher in the opener. Dory Funk Jr. used a spinning toe hold to stop Tarzan Tyler in 4:48. And in the special attraction, Ann Casey pinned Jessica Rogers with an airplane spin and press in 6:06.
A 3-hour and 10-minute Texas death match stopped by the Athletic Commission.
And that's why all the rest of those matches were so short.
Yeah, really.
But that, that was the thing. Funk Sr. had between, obviously this match with DiBiase was the one that put it on the map, but then there was a famous match with Cyclone Negro in I believe 71 or 72 that made the cover of one of the Apter magazines and went 4 falls in an hour or 44 falls rather in an hour and 44 minutes. He basically educated the fans that the Texas Death Match was the ultimate confrontation physically between two men. There was no way that any fight could be any rougher or tougher. And it would, doing stuff like this got it over to the point where they would advertise Dory Funk Sr. or somebody else, maybe usually Funk Sr. in a Texas Death Match in Amarillo at Sports Arena next week, and no other matches. If it ends early, we'll have standby matches. But that was the only thing that was advertised. And it would go on, and sometimes it would be the match, or it would be the card. And other times they'd have other matches.
What do you do if you're a fan and the match has been going on for about an hour and you have to go to the bathroom or something and you're thinking it can end?
You run. You don't want to miss anything. It's like when you're at a concert, your favorite song comes on, but God damn it, you shouldn't have that big fucking large drink. They actually, I believe it was Jerry Lawler, Bill Dundee, and Jimmy Valiant. I was just in Jackson, Tennessee not long ago for Burr Prentice. Lawler, Dundee, and Valiant against Joe LeDuc, Jean-Louis, who was Neil Guay, the hangman, and Sonny King in Jackson, Tennessee at the Coliseum in a Texas death match one night. Went like 2 hours and something. They were still wrestling at 11 o'clock, and they had the athletic commission cut it off with a curfew.
I mean, the famous match from 86, Lawler and Mantell versus Landell and Dundee, same thing. It was, I want to say it was a little over an hour, that match. I've never seen the whole thing, unfortunately, because the clips that have been around, it looks incredible, but
yeah,
it was something over an hour, I believe.
Oh, yeah, that was definitely over an hour. And then also they did one and Mark James can probably help us out on this, but I remember, I think they did a hospital elimination match in Memphis one time that went a couple of hours back in the Eddie Marlin and Tommy Gilbert days. So, occasionally you would do that and people would talk about it and that would get the gimmick over.
Did you ever think about doing something like that in Smoky Mountain?
The only thing we did was a marathon match one time with the Bodies in the Rock and Roll, most falls in an hour, and that was where we did the oxygen finish. 59 minutes and 30 seconds. Fucking, I think Robert Gibson and Jimmy Del Rey were on their knees with the referee on one side of the ring, and Ricky Morton and Tom Pritchard were passed out next to each other. And the falls were even, and I come out from underneath the goddamn ring with a fucking oxygen tank and slap it on Tom's face, and he takes a big hit of the oxygen and gets a second wind and rolls Ricky up 1, 2, 3 and wins in the last 10 seconds. But the thing, it matches that long in the modern era with the attention span of people and etc. And if it's not just the right two guys and the really or the right situation, it gets hard. But we did do in Ring of Honor the 8-man tag in Greensboro that went an hour, I think, and 25 minutes or something. It was an 8-man elimination tag match, and we advertised it, like the old days with like the 6-man tags that they used to have back in the WWF, where since it was 6 top stars, they'd advertise 3 out of 5 falls with a 2-hour time limit. Of course, it would maybe go 30 or 40 minutes or whatever. But we advertised the 2-hour time limit because it had been done in the Carolinas in the past with the Infernos and the Kentuckians and the Assassins, 90-minute tag matches, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, we did that, and it was, the people were up for it. It was a great match. But that was probably the longest thing that I've been involved, longest match I've been involved in pretty much ever.
Well, let's now move to Miami, Florida, from Saturday, July 14th, 1951.
Smoke. Miami Beach Councilman Burnett Roth may break out any time in opposition to the hot dogs at baseball games. He sent a letter to Miami Beach City Manager Claude Renshaw recently, protesting against cigarette and cigar smoke at wrestling matches in the city auditorium. He wants something done in the way of fans to draw off the smoke. He says he finds smoke to be rather intolerable and most annoying to those attending the matches.
Now, I grew up in an era where I really didn't have to worry about this. But what was it like to be in a real smoke-filled... And when you say smoke, you're talking cigarette and cigar smoke, a smoke-filled arena. What was it like, Jim?
Oh my God. And that's I do get a kick when Meltzer always says, well, Vince didn't take wrestling out of smoke-filled auditoriums, the smoking laws did. But that's actually true. You sometimes, if the Louisville Gardens was sold out, by the main event, you could hardly see across the arena. That's why I've got some crowd shots that I shot of big crowds in the Gardens, but it's so hazy. There's almost no definition, or what's the word I'm searching for, contrast anything, because the smoke was so thick by the time the main event started, especially in the wintertime when it was cold outside and they had the heat on. They were keeping all the doors closed as much as possible. But it was the same as, you watch the movies and the TV shows from the 50s and 60s, and you'll see the doctor come into his office and sit down to give you your, diagnosis of the test he's just given you. And the first thing the doctor does is light a cigarette. Nobody thought any different about it. And boy, when you got thrown out of the ring and landed on those fucking things, that was that'll get your attention also. But yeah, it was part of the atmosphere. And, the old boxing movies, it looked the same way.
Did you ever get any fans coming after the heels with a lit cigar or with their cigarette?
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, that was especially the old women. That was the thing to do. And whether they would throw them or whether they'd come up and try to get you with it. Yeah, that was a regular matchly occurrence. It wasn't even unusual. It was expected.
For our next article, Jim, we're going to go to the Detroit Free Press, Thursday, July 15th, 1971. I will read the letter to the editor, and I'll let you do the response as the editor. I printed my own wrestling magazine. The city told me I could sell copies at Cobo Hall before the matches, but when I got there last Saturday, the police made me move, and another concessionaire told me he had the exclusive rights to sell there. What am I supposed to do now? Signed, BB, St. Clair Shores.
Hawk your magazines this Saturday when Bobo Brazil will take on Wild Bull Curry. Exclusive rights claimed by the guy who hassled you are hogwash. He just didn't appreciate the competition. You don't need permission to sell printed matter on public streets. Guys who push merchandise and food must pay from $3 to $20 depending on their wares for vendors' permits. Cops won't get interested unless you're blocking pedestrians or creating a disturbance.
So there we have the editor encouraging a bootleg program to go up and go on sale. No,
I'm just BB. I'm wondering if this is Brian Buchanan.
It is.
I figured that because there was a big hoop-de-doo when the wrestling war between Bruiser and Sheik was occurring in 1972. When Bruiser was running the Olympia Stadium and Sheik was running the Cobo Arena, I think Brian was doing Bruiser's programs at the Olympia. And, of course, the body press was the various Garys, Kamensak, Mancuso, et cetera, were shooting and printing and et cetera, the body press. And so there was opposition. There was program wars also. Brian was trying to sell a program at the Cobo when he was coming from the Olympia and vice versa. So these things do happen sometimes. But they did happen back when there was big money to be made. When you think about it, when back in the days, the early 70s, when Detroit was a town that could draw 7, 8, 10,000 people for wrestling every 2 weeks. So you let's say they drew even 20, let's say 15,000 people a month. That's close to 200,000 people a year. And how many of those people were buying programs? Literally, there were tens of thousands of those programs being sold over the course of the year. So it was big money as well as the wrestling.
I know in New York and in Florida, there were people who would go to the shows, stand outside and sell their own programs. And usually they're pretty good. Usually it's good photography and a cool punk rock look. It's kind of just slapped together. But was there ever anything like that in any of the shows or towns you attended as a fan?
God, no. Because there were some of the fans, and the same thing as I had a Kodak Instamatic camera with a flash cube, right? The fan equipment. There were some of those fans, generally the middle-aged women that liked Jackie Fargo or Eddie Marlin or even that cute little young Bill Dundee, that would sell pictures to each other, the regular fans at ringside, for basically the cost of getting them printed. And that's actually kind of how I got started because my picture started getting to be better than most of the middle-aged old ladies, and they all started wanting to buy copies of mine for 25 cents or whatever. But it would probably not have been tolerated, nor was it attempted, at least around Louisville or this territory, for anybody to do unsanctioned programs in or any type of that. There was barely any, but then again, there was barely any stuff on the merchandise tables in those days besides the black and white 8x10s, and they didn't even have a program in Louisville until Jarrett took over from Goulas.
For our next story, Jim, we're going to actually have a two-parter. We're going to hear how it first got into the newspaper and then the coverage as it transpired. Let's go to Amarillo, Texas, January 3rd, 1936.
Probe of tobacco juice bout. Amarillo, Texas, January 3rd, Associated Press. The Potter County Grand Jury Friday began an investigation of a wrestling match which Danny McShane was reported to have won by spitting tobacco juice in the eyes of Bob Castle, his opponent.
And it got before the grand jury. Amazing. But let's now go to part two with some more details of this case. Once again, January 3rd, 1936.
Tobacco juice mystery thickens as bailiff hunts for wrestler. A grand jury bailiff last night was inquiring as to the whereabouts of Bob Castle, Kansas City grappler who lost a wrestling match to Danny McShane in Dutch Mantell's weekly bout Thursday night and found himself playing the hero's role as 1,500 irate fans took up the fight where he left off. A near riot followed, an alleged tobacco-spitting episode which supposedly blinded Castle and gave the spectators added incentive to razz the villainous McShane, who changed his name from Danny to Dano when he succeeded in growing a pair of handsome silken mustaches. The disturbance at the Armory was climaxed yesterday morning when the Potter County Grand Jury, two of whose members witnessed the match in which McShane is accused of using tobacco juice to win the tussle, called McShane, Mantell, and referee Jack Van Beber to its citadel on the 5th floor of the courthouse. As leaks developed in the hearing held behind guarded doors, it was learned that the real issue involves a lighted cigar allegedly poked unceremoniously into Castle's glimmers. Grand jurors held the probe under attempts to maim statutes, it was learned. McShane, it was said, grabbed the fiery torch from a spectator's mouth. A subpoena for Castle last night was the only inkling of what went on. McShane, Mantell, and Van Beber all testified before the probers, but they refused last night to talk. Assistant District Attorney Bob Underwood was conducting the investigation. Castle, however, had disappeared. McShane said he couldn't face the music. Dutch Mantell, openly proclaiming that Castle had feigned injury to provide an alibi for his defeat, said the wrestler left early yesterday morning, announcing that he was going to a friend's farm where he would remain until Sunday. In that case, Castle, who was the people's choice, probably won't give his version of the affair, inasmuch as the grand jury is scheduled to adjourn today when 47th District Court winds up its December term and moves to Canyon. It was known that ill feeling existed between McShane and Castle. The latter grunter, it seems, played havoc with a chair last week when he made kindling wood out of it by pressing it none too gently against McShane's cranium while refereeing a match between McShane and Sailor Moe. McShane, it was said, resented the intrusion. While spectators disagreed on whether McShane spit tobacco juice in Castle's eyes, threw pepper in them, or merely gouged the peepers, McShane denied the allegations in wholesale fashion. "I'm not only a good wrestler," he declared, "I'm a fine gentleman."
This is amazing. It's 1936, and just, this heat, this Texas-style wrestling where the week before there was a chair. Now there was something that happened. Somehow people were confusing a lit cigar with tobacco juice or potentially, what did they say? Potentially pepper.
It could have been peppers. And of course, promoter Dutch Mantell, not to be confused with the current Dutch Mantell, but that is the Dutch Mantell that Dutch Mantell got his name from, was obviously probably loving this publicity.
He had to have been, and 1,500 fans were ready to riot and kill Danny McShane because of this.
And Danny McShane, of course, obviously, gets a lot of credit for not inventing but popularizing the blade, and was an incredible heel wrestler back in the 30s and 40s and a Texas icon. But can you imagine how hard, what would be the equivalent of 80 years later, 1936 to 2017, of getting 1,500 people in a building in a town that size, of the size it was then?
Oh, geez.
Because Amarillo ain't the biggest town in the world right now.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
And there were no interstates. And everybody still didn't have a car at that point. They'd only been around for about 30, 35 years or so. So when you think about 1,500 people and a riot at the finish of a wrestling match going to the grand jury, it's classic pro wrestling.
And Bob Castle skipped town.
And Bob Castle, because he knew what was good for him.
Yeah, Dutch Mantel said, get out of town, go to your friend's farm.
Yeah, but before shit starts happening, get back out of here.
Come back after the grand jury is done. You can come back then. But we're going to have another two-parter because they're both kind of related, Jim, in our next two stories. The first one is from Corinth, Mississippi, Friday, May 14th, 1937.
Wrestler dies on the mat by the Associated Press. Corinth, Mississippi, May 15th, Eddie Baker, 36, a light heavyweight wrestler, failed to budge from the canvas after he had been pinned by his opponent, Roy Welch of Jackson, Tennessee here. 800 fans shouted for the match to continue. A physician was called to the ring. He found that Baker was dead. Doctors expressed the opinion Baker died from heart failure brought on by strain. The body was held here today while officers sought to locate relatives in Indianapolis, Indiana.
And a similar story from 35 years later, in Charlotte, North Carolina, February 21st, 1972.
Wrestler dies after victory. Charlotte, Associated Press. Luther Jacob Goodall of Gibsonville, North Carolina, former Norfolk State football player, died Monday night shortly after winning a professional wrestling match at Charlotte's Park Center. Goodall, 46, wrestled under the name of Luther Lindsay. Goodall had pinned Bobby Paul after only 10 minutes of their one-fall match, scoring with a diving belly flop. When Goodall failed to get up after the count, the referee and police came to his assistance.
I must admit, I never knew either story. I never knew that the guy died against Roy Welch, and I didn't know about Luther Lindsay dying in the ring.
Well, I got to be honest with you, that's the first one that I've heard about the Roy Welch story, to be perfectly honest, but having been 1936, that's probably easy to understand. But no, I think Les Thatcher was there that night. I believe him mentioning that he was there, but Luther Lindsay, that story is pretty well known. He was not only the guy that Stu Hart said was the toughest shooter of all time and was one of his favorite people in the world. I think the story was that Stu Hart carried a picture of Luther Lindsay in his wallet until he died.
Yeah.
That's what he thought of him.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was just one of those things. He was that night in just a preliminary match against an underneath guy, boom, but had a heart attack. He was black and I believe had high blood pressure. I'm not being racist there, but black folks have apparently bigger problems with high blood pressure in a lot of cases. And that's what brought that on. But he had been an athlete and a top shooter and a great wrestler all of his life. He was a big babyface at the time. He had done a lot of groundbreaking work as a babyface in the South before, the Civil Rights Act and during segregation and everything, but he still was able to get over and work at a pretty high level a lot of places.
This story is February 21st, 1972. It is interesting how many wrestlers died either in the ring or directly after the match within just a couple of years of this. Dory Funk Sr., Ray Gunkel. I mean, it happened several times beyond even that.
Yeah, and it was that was, now that you bring it up, but between Gunkel, Luther Lindsay, and of course Dory Funk Sr., he died after a match, but it was a friendly shooting match at the ranch instead of an actual match. But that all happened within like a year and a half, 2-year period.
Yeah, and Roy Welch. Just another amazing story for Roy Welch to be involved in.
He was involved in everything. Can you imagine the shit that went on that he probably saw in his lifetime? That's just insane, especially in those days.
We're going to talk a little bit now, Jimmy, about taxes, about the IRS and wrestling. And let's go to this first story. It is from July 27th, 1940.
Audit of Darrow Books started, Los Angeles, Associated Press. An audit was begun today on the books of wrestling promoter Jack Darrow and the Mont Booking Agency, while the newly organized American Professional Wrestlers Association mapped a campaign against the long-established Darrow-Mont-Matt regime. The California Athletic Commission ordered the audit after the wrestlers charged at a hearing yesterday that they were not getting fair treatment from the Mont office, owned by Joe Toots Mont, and had been handed non-negotiable checks by Darrow. Darrow and Mont worked together promoting match shows at the Olympic Auditorium here. In a surprise move, wrestler Nick Lutz took out a booker's license of his own and, claiming to have the backing of 40 or more wrestlers, said he would book mat men around the state. Darrow previously had told the commission there was no monopoly and promised to engage talent from agencies other than the Mont office. The wrestlers' chief complaint against Mont was that they were compelled to sign blank agreements and were never told exactly what they would get for wrestling. They charged that Mont's cut of gate receipts was excessive.
Well, a lot has been said throughout the years about Toots Mont. Let me ask you first, do you know anything about this organization, the American Professional Wrestlers Association?
No.
Yeah, exactly. Me neither.
I think probably a bunch of the boys got together and decided, well, we're going to put it into this. And, well, when was this, 1940?
Yeah.
About 77 years later, you see how far that got. The guys have never been able to band together, and they weren't going to do it then. And imagine that, signed blank agreements, and we never know what we're going to get. He is the guy who invented wrestling, Toots Mont.
Yeah, were there many agreements signed between wrestler and promoter back then?
Actually, I've read a lot about in those days, that far back. Some guys signing, like, I guess they were more or less appearance contracts or booking contracts where I give you the right to tell me where to go, Toots, that type of thing. But there weren't any formal contracts as we know them today until the 80s when the thing between Vince and Crockett got. I think Crockett signed contracts before Vince did, because I know we got our first one handed to us in, I'm going to say, May of 1986, right about the time that Tully's friend had seen us getting on that U.S. Air flight to go to New York on our day off. We got on that kayfabe meeting with Vince Sr. or Vince Jr. When we came back about a week later, Crockett was handing us a contract saying, hey, guys, want to guarantee you this amount of money here.
Tully Blanchard, the agent for Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express. Who knew?
Yeah, Tully had a best friend that worked at U.S. Air, and we thought we were getting by with something. And on our one day off that we had that month, we arranged to be flown up to New York in the morning and flown back in the afternoon. And we snuck over there. We told no one. And he's the fucking gate agent when we're getting on the plane.
Toots Mont in Los Angeles. That's not usually the place you think of Toots Mont.
Oh, well, no. At that point in time, he had some element of control over wrestling almost all over the country, because that was, when you think about it, before the territories formulated after national TV, you had promoters in all those areas, but they still had to use talent from a certain amount of booking offices. That's why Nick Goulas and Roy Welch were just starting up in Nashville, but they'd be supplying talent all over the South. And Toots Mont is well known for being a part of the New York booking office, but he ran out of Pittsburgh for a while. And there's many times he was involved at the California promotions. And, they would go back and forth because he had a stable of traveling talent that had names and was publicized in the newspapers. Whereas you might find local guys for your preliminary matches, but for the main event guys, you had to go to him or a few other people that would control not only a good stable, but a version of the world title at that point in time. That's why they were always trying to double cross the other promoters out of the world title. Because if you had the world title in your stable, more people would go to you to book talent than they would the other fucking guys.
Wrestling's always been a cash business, especially in 1940, more so then than now, obviously. So what would auditing his books actually do? How much of what they actually made it into the books? If you had the guess.
There's no way to, especially back in those days, whatever they wanted to make it to paper, made it to paper. So that if they had to show anybody anything, they would, if they were smart. I mean, I don't know, of Carnation Lou Darrow, he didn't get to run wrestling in California in those days by being an idiot, I wouldn't think. So, if they were smart, they had something to show the outside world.
Well, on this topic of taxes and wrestling and revenues, let's go to this next story. It's from August 10th, 1983.
Bruiser owes tax. Indianapolis Associated Press. Championship Wrestling Incorporated and Dick the Bruiser Afflis owe the state $28,676 in taxes on revenues from wrestling events, a judge has ruled. Attorney General Lindley F. Pearson went to court on behalf of the State Boxing Commission and the State Treasurer's Office to collect the 10% tax on wrestling match proceeds. Championship Wrestling refused to pay the tax, arguing it violated the due process and equal protection clauses of the U.S. and Indiana Constitutions. Marion Superior Judge Kenneth R. Johnson rejected the challenge to the tax Tuesday.
Yeah, who wants to pay the Athletic Commission?
Well, exactly. And 1983, Bruiser was done as a promotion in Indianapolis by that point, pretty much. Jarrett had tried to send some talent up there at Thanksgiving time of 82, but Bruiser wouldn't give Jarrett full control, and Jarrett didn't see it as a battle he was going to win. So this had to have been an outstanding matter for several years, but when you think about it, Bruiser's territory had not been a big money territory since the mid-70s. Even though he had some good houses in Indianapolis, he didn't, when Miniker was the booker and they had all that talent and they were in the war with the Sheik for Detroit from 72 to 74, and for about a year or two after that, still Indianapolis was a territory. It was, you could draw 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people in Indianapolis a couple times a month. But after that, it was not a full-time schedule. The state of Indiana, it was, the territory got older. So the point being, if the Athletic Commission was supposed to get 10% and Bruiser ran up a $28,000 tab, that means that was $280-something thousand of wrestling events that he owed those taxes on. And if it was 1983, it had to be for the previous few years. So you see how much money was involved in the promotion of a shitty wrestling territory is what I'm trying to say. Just a shitty territory could get you that far behind in taxes.
In general, did the IRS get on a lot of wrestling promoters? Because again, it was a cash business, and it was something where, if someone wanted to stand at the door and count how many people were coming in, they actually could. Do you know any stories of that, of the IRS? I mean, I know Vince was audited every year until he created Erwin R. Shyster as his little pseudo revenge. But are there lots of stories of the IRS coming after wrestling promoters?
Actually, most of it's the IRS coming after wrestlers, because the promoters, here's the thing. If cash fell off the truck on the way back from Corinth, Mississippi to Nashville or whatever, there's really no way to tell. But when that promoter can prove that he paid John Brown $900 a week for that year to be his top heel, and John Brown didn't pay tax on any of it, that's where they go. The promoters, if they had companies and they had businesses and they generally had people that halfway knew what they were doing, and I'm sure somebody's going to bring up an episode of some promoter getting in horrible tax trouble, and that I'm just not calling to mind right now, but they were running businesses and they had people that did that shit for a living and to take care of their books one way or the other, and they knew how that shit worked. And then here's a bunch of wild-ass wrestlers. Can you imagine Don Fargo sitting down in front of a tax attorney? What's the best way to plan for my retirement? Those things did not happen. So the guys, as usual, got to shit into the stick.
There are lots of things I can't imagine Don Fargo doing, but then again, there are lots of things I can easily imagine him doing. And with that, let's go to our final story this week, Jim. It is from Sunday, July 24th, 1955.
Florida youths find looks deceive after sad episode. Miami Beach, Florida, Associated Press. It was a case of mistaken identity. 4 youths reported yesterday after 3 of them were treated at a hospital. Patrolman Dave Schumann relates the story. The 4 high school boys were riding about Friday night when they spotted a car occupied by 2 men wearing long curly hair. The boys called out remarks which the long hairs resented. There was a general scuffle. 3 of the youths wound up with cuts and bruises. 1 had a broken arm. The 4th stayed out of it all and was unhurt. One of the long-haired gents was cut, the other uninjured. All concerned were charged with disorderly conduct and booked at city jail. There, the sad truth was learned by the youths. Jim Shea, Dean Eichelberger, Fred Caltle, and John Wright, all 17. The men with long hair were Ray Stevens and Don Colt, professional wrestlers who wore their hair that way for stage effect. They knew all about the manly art of self-defense. Everybody involved posted $25 bond for a later hearing.
Okay, forget about Ray Stevens even for a second here.
I can't believe I just mentioned Don Fargo. He's in the next, because I did not proofread this.
No, you didn't.
So, but there's a variety of things that you can and can't imagine Don Fargo doing. Sitting down with a tax attorney, no. beating up 4 teenagers that whistled about his hair? Yes.
Of course, Don Colt is Don Fargo's real name. And again, what's the luck? They think they're seeing a couple of men with long bleached hair. They're going to criticize him. And it turns out it's Don Fargo, a notorious tough guy, and Ray Stevens, who could handle himself pretty good as well. And
both Ray and Don were not 30 at that point. They were probably in their late 20s. And they got bleached blonde hair. Elvis was not even a thing at this point, really. And they're in Miami Beach. And yeah, I can see. And of course, Ray and Don Stevens, or Don Fargo was Don Stevens then, because Ray and Don Stevens were a brother tag team right before Don Stevens met Jackie Fargo. And that's confusing, I know, but Don Fargo was a member of 2 legendary brother bleach blonde, actually. And then Ray Stevens was also Roy Shire's brother, Ray Shire. The whole bleach blonde heel tag team thing in the late 50s, Don Fargo was right in the middle of it, and so was Stevens.
They both left this tag team to form other brother tag teams.
Yes, and brother, were they good too? But yeah, well, I mean, there's stories all the time of goofs just happening to pick on one of the boys at random. You know, there was a story in the paper in Charlotte, that was just on Twitter here recently. Some carload of kids smarted off to Wahoo McDaniel at a shopping mall. And then the statement was, well, then he grabbed me and just stuck my head into a bicycle rack. And then one of Wahoo's comments was about the other guy, so I slapped him and threw him into the back seat. There's shit like that. And they used to, when Vern Gagne had his training facility and was breaking guys in, they used to have a variety of the pros there that guys could work out with. And, you know, when guys would look at those big guys like, you know, oh my God, whether it be a Mad Dog Vachon or Larry the Axe Hitting is huge or whatever, they'd see the guy on the end. I'll take him, and it'd be Danny Hodge.
I read a story similar to that in the book about Hawaii wrestling, 50th State Big Time Wrestling, where Ed Francis and maybe another guy, maybe it was Curtis Iokea, they go out with Gene LaBelle, who's in the territory. And they're out, and some guy starts picking on the rather slight-looking, red-headed Gene LaBelle, not realizing he's a judo master who just destroys him, and they have to get off that island as quick as possible.
You can't judge a book by looking at the cover.
No, unless it's the Don Fargo book. That book you may be able to judge.
Yeah, that book, you can look at the cover, you can pretty much judge what Don Fargo was all about by that.
Well, Jim, another episode of In the News, in the Books. Any closing comments you want to make to the 605ers?
Good night. And good news.